Okay, so this video is on homeostatic mechanisms, and in fact there are quite a few, so I'm going to split into two parts. So this is part one. These mechanisms obviously are designed to maintain homeostasis and can involve the nervous system, the endocrine system, and a combination of both. So just a little reminder about some of the key interfaces between the nervous system and the endocrine system. One of the key parts of the nervous system involved here is the hypothalamus that sits below the thalamus in the center of the brain. It's closely connected to the pituitary gland. If we have a look at that, there are neurosecretory cells within the nervous system that will actually secrete through the portal vein and communicate with endocrine cells within the pituitary. These produce other hormones which then flow out through the blood flow and affect other glands or other parts of the body. So there's a very close connection between the brain and the endocrine system through the hypothalamus pituitary axis. So what are some of the things that controls? Well, we can see the interface between those happening here in the control of temperature. So obviously normal temperature is around 35 to 38 degrees Celsius. If there's an increase in body temperature, this is actually detected by the hypothalamus and processed within the brain, which will then send out some signals through different mechanisms. So one of the response elements, the effectors, might be the capillaries, and so by blood vessels dilating or opening up, more blood can go through those surface capillaries, and we increase heat loss through radiation at the skin. There can also be innervation of sweat glands, which will release sweat, and then via evaporative cooling, that will cool the body as well. So both of these things are going to decrease the temperature. That will be picked up the hypothalamus, which can then shut off those responses in a negative feedback loop. Conversely, if the temperature is too low, that also gets picked up by the hypothalamus, which will signal to constrict the blood capillaries, which is why you sometimes look pale on the surface when you are cold, because that is decreasing blood flow to the skin, reducing the heat loss. And you could also have shivering through activation of skeletal muscles, which through metabolic processes increases the metabolic rate, and energy is released through heat energy as the shivering happens, increasing the temperature, and then both of those again will feed back, so the hypothalamus deactivates those responses, again in a negative feedback loop. The next example relates to that about metabolism. So if metabolism needs to increase in order to increase the body temperature, as we discussed, or for other reasons, that is also controlled through the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary through thyroid secreting hormone, or thyrotropin. So the thyroid is a gland here that sits around the esophagus and trachea. By release of THS, there's secretion of thyrotropin, which goes to the thyroid glands, which release another hormone called thyroxine. This travels to cells in the body and increases cellular metabolism, increases the rate of breakdown of chemicals, food chemicals, and through respiration, the production of energy by increasing that rate of cellular metabolism. But this thyroxine also then itself has a negative feedback onto the hypothalamic stimulation of the anterior pituitary and stops its own release. So that's a negative feedback loop on the amount of thyroxine produced, but thyroxine is the hormone that increases cellular metabolism. That's the key thing to pick up there. The next example also relates to metabolism in the sense of following a meal, you have an increase in blood sugar, and how is that regulated? So here we have two hormones being discussed, insulin here and glucagon here, and they have opposing actions. So after a meal, there's an increase in blood sugar. This is picked up by the pancreas, and the beta cells of the pancreas release insulin as a hormone. That travels to many cells and tissues in the body. In adipose tissues, which are the fat cells, they pick up glucose and store that as fat. Also in the liver cells, they pick up glucose, store that as glycogen, but also in regular muscle cells, they have a signal to pick up that glucose and use it as well straight away. So when there's blood sugar available, lots of cells in the body get the signal that they need to take up that glucose and use it or store it through insulin. On the other hand, once that is depleted in between meals, you might have low blood sugar. In this case, you have the opposite. The alpha cells of the pancreas will release glucagon. Glucagon, again, is a hormone that travels to many tissues. In this case, it's talking about signaling to the liver to break down that glycogen into glucose. So glycogen is a macromolecule, a carbohydrate made up of polysaccharides, lots of glucose stuck together. It's the animal equivalent of starch. So glycogen is broken down into glucose, which releases into the bloodstream. Also, you would have the breakdown of fats as well. But the key action there is that glucagon is going to break down glycogen in the liver to release blood sugar. So both of these are negative feedback loops. Too much blood sugar is brought down by the uptake of the sugar through the action of insulin. Too little sugar, the level of sugar is increased by the action of glucagon, returning that to normal. The final one to talk about here is around the control of carbon dioxide and through breathing. So the body needs to maintain that level of oxygen and carbon dioxide by monitoring carbon dioxide in the blood. Gives an idea of where we're at in the breathing cycle and how long it's been between breaths. And so if there's been a long time between, arterial blood is getting high in CO2. So the blood in the arteries has a high concentration of dissolved carbon dioxide that can travel through what's called the blood-brain barrier and be dissolved in cerebrospinal fluid, which is the fluid that surrounds the brain. In the CSF, the CO2 actually undergoes a chemical reaction in which hydrogen ions are released, and this decreases the pH of the CSF. This is picked up by these breathing control centers in the brainstem, and that's a signal to them, the dropping in pH, that the level of carbon dioxide in the blood is too high and it's time to expel some air and get in some fresh air. And so they will innervate or send nerves to both the diaphragm to control breathing and also to the heart in order to increase the pulse and control that. And so there's feedback in both directions from the brain to organs to control that level of breathing, and the key signal there is the stimulus is the decrease in the pH of the CSF. I'll pause now so that we can start part 2 and look at some other mechanisms.